Dear all, I welcome you to Microsoft Azure Pakistan Community March 2023 meetup, and I will start by giving some housekeeping rules. In our meetup group, we plan to meet up at least once a month on Saturdays, and these meetings are organized using Microsoft Teams. The online meetings would be recorded, and later the recording would be uploaded to Microsoft Azure Pakistan Community YouTube channel. I would request you all to please mute yourself during the meeting. The meetup time would be around 1 hour to 1 hour and 30 minutes, depending upon the time needed by the speaker. And there would be 10-15 minutes for QA session in the end. And it is really good if you can write your questions in the chat window. Microsoft Azure Pakistan community is a part of Microsoft Azure Tech Groups. Therefore, we follow a code of conduct. And you should be friendly and welcoming. Be patient, be thoughtful in how you communicate in person and online, be respectful and inclusive, be open and curious, and reach out to the organizers if you need anything. Today we'll be talking about Introduction to SQL Server 2022. This is the latest version of SQL Server database that is released by Microsoft on 16th of November last year. And this session will provide you an overview of the SQL Server. Today we have an honor of having Javier with us, and he's a director DBA and BI Services at Mediterranean Shipping Company with more than 20 years of experience working with SQL Server, including Azure SQL. His specialization is administration performance tuning, high availability, and disaster recovery. Javier is a Microsoft MVP since 2016 and an MCT, and he is a frequent speaker in technical conferences and events such as SQL Saturdays, PASS virtual groups, PASS marathon, 24 Hours SQL PASS, vOpen, GroupBy, Data Saturdays, and Azure Global Bootcamps. He is one of the group leaders of SQL Argentina community and Microsoft Azure Data Advisory Board member. I welcome you, Javier, to Microsoft Azure Pakistan Community March meetup, and I'm very much looking forward to your session. So please go ahead with sharing your slides.
All right. Thank you, sir. Let me share my screen here. Let me know when you see it. You see my screen?
Not yet. No, I can see your screen, yes.
Okay, very good. Excellent, so let's start. First of all, thank you, sir, and thank you to your community to having me today. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here. I love to be part of as many communities as I can. This is a topic that I found particularly interesting. I've been doing this since a while, starting actually with introduction to SQL Server 2017 back in the days, then 2019, and now 2022. Then I have another session which is a little bit more deeper on the focus on performance analysis, right? But this one will cover mainly everything that is related to SQL Server 2022 on a high level on all the areas that is covered. So let's start. So name of the session is Introduction to SQL Server 2022. A little bit about myself, as before, as Serge has mentioned, my name is Javier Villegas. I am from Buenos Aires, Argentina, and I've been working with SQL Server since a while. SQL Server 2022 released in November 2022 for the PASS Data Community Summit. I had the honor to be invited to the event. as a speaker, and also the Microsoft product team highlighted the company I work for in specific features that we've been testing with SQL Server 2022. You know that they do not release a new product from one day to the other overnight, right? There is an important path to go through to reach the final version. So I had the opportunity to start testing the very first private previews, then the public previews, and finally the RTM version, right? So during the presentation, I was able to provide our use case in the stage and show it to everybody, right? It's interesting because SQL Server 2022 is not just one new thing and that's it, right? It's an evolution of what Microsoft is calling the modern version of SQL servers, which are since SQL Server 2016, right? In 2016, with that release, they start adding a set of features that then on the upcoming major releases, there were enhancing and continue evolving until today with SQL Server 2022. One of these most important cases to highlight is back then the introduction of Query Store, right? Query Store is definitely one of those features focuses on performance that has been evolved since then. And then when we talk about performance, I will mention a little bit more about it, right? With SQL Server 2017, a major change on the multi-platform area, right? So for the first time ever, SQL Server was able to run not only in the Windows platform, but also in the major Linux releases like Red Hat, SUSE, and Ubuntu, right? And also the introduction of being able to run SQL Server on containers, right? Super cool, super useful. Then in SQL Server 2019, there was an evolution of all the performance features with the introduction of what is called intelligent query processing, right? And the very first introduction to data virtualization that we will cover also later on, right? With that, we reach SQL Server 2022. It's quite interesting because Microsoft called this the connected version of SQL servers. Connected is because it has a very big interaction within the SQL Server product and Azure, right? You know that SQL Server, or let me go back a little bit. Several years ago, Microsoft has introduced this concept of Azure SQL, right? Azure SQL is now an umbrella that is covering many products like SQL Server and services, right? Like Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance, right? And also Azure SQL Edge. Quickly, Azure SQL Edge is the possibility of running SQL Server on a Raspberry Pi, on an ARM device, right? With the very same footprint of SQL Server that we know since forever, right? Of course, it's not targeted to every workload, but for certain scenarios at edge, like collecting and processing information coming from multiple sensors, is really, really good. So going back to the slide, right? This is the connected SQL, the cloud connected version, right? So also Microsoft is trying to target these releases in a different way. They are not saying that we have a new feature and this feature does this. No, they are saying there is a challenge, right? They describe a challenge, and then there are a set of features that will try to address that particular situation described from that challenge, right? So in this case, right, we will see that SQL Server 2022 is highly connected with Azure in three main areas, right? Disaster recovery with the introduction of link feature for managed instance, right? we will cover it in deep later. Azure Synapse Link that will give us the possibility of doing ETLs for feeding our data warehouses on a different way. Again, we will cover it later. And then with Microsoft PureView integration that will help us to do an assessment, a lineage, and get an insight of the data that we are dealing with in our user database. All right. Additionally, we have another interesting challenge that is solved with Leisure for SQL Server, in where is this the very first time where Microsoft gives us the possibility of using cryptography or blockchain technology within SQL Server, right? Super cool. We will cover it in a minute as well. At the same time, since more than 10 years, SQL Server is the most secure platform to run our relational databases. And finally, building query intelligence performance. Microsoft is doing a big investment in this area because the goal is to be able to run our code faster without changing a single line of code, right? We will see some cool examples later on. And all this, as I mentioned briefly earlier, since the edge, going also to the on-premise environment and the cloud, right? So, the capabilities, as I said, cloud connected, right? Building query intelligence, right? Scalability, security, and availability. We will see that there are a bunch of features on these three areas that, of course, Microsoft cannot advertise them all because, you know, there are too many. We will mention them and we will cover some of them. Data virtualization. This is quite interesting because it gives us the possibility of, from SQL Server, being able to access the modern storage, right? For example, a data lake, an Azure storage, an Azure storage account with a container, a data lake, and access that data directly from SQL Server, like if it is our table, and being able to, you know, join with our local tables and, you know, being able to do really cool stuff. And of course, a lot of enhancement in Transact SQL, right? This is the language that we've been using to work, to write our store procedure, our code, and there are a bunch of cool enhancements in that area. With that, also, a lot of improvement in how we handle JSON data type. As mentioned, SQL Server 2022, in order to deploy it, we have multiple options, right? Windows, Linux, we can run it in Kubernetes containers, in a Docker containers, in Azure, on-premise, right? Multiple options, that's the goal, right? There are a bunch of small changes during the setup process, which is interesting to highlight them because, you know, if you go today, download the installer, you will see that there are several things that were removed, right? And some other new things that were added. First of all the part related to machine learning, in where Microsoft, coming in from 2019, where Microsoft was installing the components to run, you know, Java, to run Python, to run, you know, R store procedures and code. Now it's gone, and it's gone, but not for good. Now they are giving you the possibility for you to bring your own libraries to run it in there. So Microsoft is not providing their own libraries anymore. You can do it by yourself, right? And then there is an interesting option, which is the possibility of having this extension in Azure, right? So you will see your SQL Server from the Azure SQL portal, and also being able to handle the licenses as pay as you go, right? That means you don't have to buy your licenses like enterprise per core, etc., you can use the option as pay as you go, right? That's of course going to be, depending on the negotiation that you have with Microsoft, your own contract. But, beside the existing editions, developer still free, standard, enterprise core, you also have this possibility of using pay as you go, right? So we have the 4 SKU that we know since ever: Express, Standard, Enterprise, and Developer. All right. So in the area of connectivity, there are not only 3 things that were included. So we mentioned briefly the possibility of integrate or to do disaster recovery with Azure SQL Managed Instance. Again, we will cover it later with a cool demo. Also, the possibility of interacting with Azure Synapse Analytics for data warehouse workload, PureView for data lineage, right? But also, we have the possibility now to authenticate our SQL Server 2022 with Azure Active Directory, right? So for the very first time, we don't have to use the Windows authentication with our own local domain. We can use Azure Active Directory. Also, taking the benefit of Azure, we have all these services called Microsoft Defender for SQL, right? Basically, those services will help you in a bunch of areas. One of them is assessment, right? It will help you do an assessment on what you have on your SQL Server databases. But at the same time, it provides the possibility of doing like a, constant police watching all the activity on your SQL Server, and if detect that it may be an activity that is not safe because, this could be SQL injection or any activity that may seem like suspicious, you can define rules to take certain actions, you can get alerts, etc., 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 right? So those are the benefit of the cloud connected options in SQL Server 2022. So we reached the first challenge, right? We know that it's quite difficult to set up and maintain a disaster recovery solution, right? It's not impossible, but it's hard, right? You have to have your other server on a different location, another virtual machine on a different Azure region, create your clusters, create the availability groups, add the databases, etc., etc., etc. Since ever, with availability groups, you have the possibility of creating multiple nodes within your availability group, but initially they have to be all SQL Server within the same version, right? So all SQL Server 2016, all 17, all 19, right? Then with the introduction of distribute availability group, you can combine, right, with multiple cluster and also multiple versions, right? But, always between SQL servers. Now, with this feature, link feature for managed instance, right, you are able to set up quite easily, right, a distribute availability group of your user databases between a SQL Server that can be running in your own data center on-premise, right? It can be running on a virtual machine in the cloud, and do the synchronization against an Azure SQL managed instance. And also, that replica on managed instance is same as in availability group, right? A read-only replica. So you can point your read-only workload against the managed instance, right? Additionally, you have the possibility to do a failover. You can switch the roles, right? Meaning that the primary, which is now the SQL Server 2022 on-premise, can become the replica, and the replica, which is the managed instance, can become the new primary, right? So you can do the failback and failover with absolutely no problem, right? Soon, we will also have the possibility of having this option with the licensing on the DR option as free, right? This is more to come. There are also other enhancements in the disaster recovery area. For example, we know that with availability groups, we can synchronize user databases, right? But what happened with logins, with SQL jobs, and all the system objects? We know that we have to use maybe PowerShell or any other community solution to be able to synchronize login, SQL shop, etc. Now, with the introduction of this the new availability groups, you can also I missed the word, contain availability group. You can also synchronize the content of master and MSDB. So this way you synchronize all your system objects within the availability group, right? So this link feature for managed instance is as simple as a network connectivity between SQL Server and a managed instance, right? Something that today we do with absolutely no problem. And the concept is exactly the same, right? You have your database over there and it's synchronizing asynchronously, right? So you have all your data up in the cloud, right? Super interesting. Then there is something quite requested, right? Because until SQL Server 2019, if you were planning to go from your SQL Server option to the cloud, for managed instance, for example, it was as simple as taking a backup of your databases and restoring them to managed instance. But let's say that if you want to do the other way around, right? You have your databases in managed instance and you want it back in SQL Server, you didn't have that possibility. Now, with SQL Server 2022, you can take a backup of your user databases in the managed instance and restore it to any SQL Server 2022. Super, super useful for a bunch of options. The second challenge, ETL processes for data warehousing, ETL, extraction, transformation, and load, are also quite complex to maintain, right? Because basically what you do is you create your data flows, right? And with, for example, integration services or Azure Data Factory, and on a scheduled basis, you grab the data from your SQL Server and then you push it to the data warehouse. In this case, Azure Synapse Analytics, right? But again, this is not continuously, right? You may run your ETLs once an hour, once a day, once a week, right? And we know that right after we move that data, there's maybe some data that could be out of date. So if someone is doing analytics with the data, is using data that is not current, maybe it's from 2 hours ago or something. And there could be certain scenarios in where doing analytics with real-time data could be quite useful. So with the link feature for Synapse Analytics, now you can select several tables within your SQL Server user databases and replicate them almost real-time against a dedicated SQL pool in Synapse. That means your operational tables in where you do all the inserts, update, deletes, and you have your main core business application, right? I'm going to continue running in there, but then almost real-time, the tables you define will be synchronizing, right? Again, almost real-time against the Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool. So this way you can do analytics, you can do machine learning, you can create your Power BI dashboard at the top of it and have analytics using real-time data. Consider the possibility of collecting data from different sensors from around the world, right, on your SQL Server, and then replicating them almost real-time against Azure Synapse Analytics, doing your machine learning, and then having your dashboard so management can see the Power BI dashboard with real-time data. Super cool. Let's see these two features in action. The one for managed instance disaster recovery, and the one for Azure Synapse link for SQL Server. Right? In this case, quick disclaimer here, this is a recording because it was done with a specific SQL Server version, right? Which, I mean, it's not the final one, but eventually it can work absolutely the same way. So I will put the recording here and I will explain what it's doing. So, okay, first of all, I have here a Management Studio. Oh, here we go. So, Management Studio 18, right? We are connecting to a SQL Server 2022, and from there we have this new option, Azure SQL Managed Instance Link. And within that option, we have replicate or failover, right? So what we will do there is we'll do the initial setup, replicate database, right? So we have a similar wizard than the one that we know from an availability group, right? It's doing all the pre-checks, right? For example, it's highly recommended to have these two trade flags enabled, 1800 and 9567 on the SQL Server, right? Again, it's not mandatory, but it's super recommended because the way it moves or it flows the data from SQL to managed instance will be compressed. So this way, there's going to be less latency, right? And, you know, there are a few other things that are being checked. So I go to my SQL Server 2022, right? And I enable these two trace flags on a system level, and that's it. I do that, I leave it there. I just wanted to highlight that these trace flags are needed. So we put it there, right? We execute it, that's it. We go back to the wizard, right? We rerun it, and now all the prerequisites are correct. So we go next, and it will do an assessment on which databases we can synchronize with managed instance. We have this one called contain DB in where it's ready. So I'm going to hit next. Now the next step is just connect to our Azure subscription to get the list of all the available managed instances. Right? So once we reach that point, once we get connected to our managed instance, then the next step will be doing the synchronization. Right? So I'm canceling here the wizard, and after it's ready, I show you how it looks like. We have the availability group for another database called DemoDB, right? This is in SQL Server 2022. And then we have the distribute availability group for the same database, right? So when we go to SQL Server 2022, now we have this table, DemoDB, and this table called sample table CSV. I just do a select on the table, and we see that there are 145,000 rows, and the smaller ID is 5,000, right? So the next step will be to connect to my managed instance in where I have the same databases as part of the distribute availability group that I just created, and I see exactly the same, right? Because it's replicating, right? So same as on an availability group, if we try to delete something on a read-only replica, we get this nasty error message saying, hey, you cannot do any update, delete, or insert because the database is in read-only, right? So that is not changing at all. You have only one read-write primary. So the next step is also showing you that in Management Studio I have the three options: SQL Server, the managed instance, that is the one in between, and the final one is the dedicated SQL pool in Azure Synapse Analytics. I do exactly the same select, and I see, again, the same table with the same ID, 5,000, right? So the next step will be just delete few rows in our primary, our SQL Server 2022, right? So in this case, I will delete everything that is smaller than 6,000, right, on the primary. So I'm allowed to do it. I just delete 1,000 rows. So when I do my select, now I see that my smaller ID is 6,000, right? And without doing anything, I go to my managed instance, I do the same select, right? And now what I see, that is fully synchronized because now my smaller ID is 6,000, right? If I also go to the dedicated SQL pool in Azure Synapse Analytics, I see exactly the same. I run the same query, and now my first ID is 6,000. Without any change, I'm just modifying my primary database, the tables in my database, and what is happening is synchronizing against managed instance for disaster recovery purpose, right? And against my dedicated SQL pool in Azure. In this case, I'm also showing that I can add or insert more rows, and I see them with absolutely no problem. This is super cool because we can do a bunch of things in real time. We can have disaster recovery, and we can have a data warehouse online with no major changes, right? Good. Let's move on. Okay, so in the security area, I mentioned briefly before that we have the integration with Azure Active Directory, the integration with Azure Pureview for data lineage, and the integration with Microsoft Defender for SQL. Right? Now we get into another challenge, which is query tuning, right? We all know that query tuning is quite expensive and really time-consuming. Right? You have to do a bunch of things: monitor your environment, identify the statements, the store procedure, the processes that are having certain performance issues, right? Take an action to solve that problem, right? And then keep monitoring to see if that change is applied and it's not affecting anything. And in some cases, or in most of the cases till now, it will require to make change in the code, right? You name it. You can rewrite the statement, you can add hints, you can create indexes, etc., etc., etc. But that is part of the expensive query tuning process, right? This is what every single DBA has been doing basically on a daily basis, right? So, with the introduction of intelligent query processing, right, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, is mainly something that has been evolved since SQL Server 2016 with the introduction of Query Store. Briefly, Query Store gives us the possibility of enabling it at user database level, right? And it will collect every single plan for all the queries running on our user database, as well as runtime statistics, right? This way, we can easily see if there was a change in the plan, and maybe eventually it's not as good as the previous one, right? And we can take certain actions, like, for example, forcing the plan, right? And we can also see runtime statistics, how many times it was executed, the minimum duration, maximum duration, average, read, write, etc., etc., etc. This is something that we can do since SQL Server 2016. In 2017, there was the introduction of the possibility of having automatic query tuning, right? That for certain cases, if there was a regression that was detected and stored in query store, automatically had the possibility of forcing the last known good plan by itself without any user intervention, right? Then Microsoft continue with this evolution, and in 2017 initially, right, and 2019 they made a lot of investment in this intelligent query processing. For example, the memory grant feedback, those processes that, you know, when you run it is gonna when you run it for the very first time and SQL Server compile it, right, it will assign a certain amount of memory, right? But, you know, that memory can be, you know, too much, and we're going to be wasting memory, or too little, and we're going to be using the TempDB to allocate the memory that we don't have, right? We will see that with memory grant feedback, right, what SQL Server is doing now is after executing a query, a process, it will provide a feedback to adjust the memory on the fly, right? That is there since SQL Server 2017, right? One of the main problems that we used to have is that, you know, SQL Server was collecting all this information, the intelligent query processing, the automatic query tuning, the query store, etc., etc. But when we restarted the instance, right, when we restarted the server, all that information was gone, and we had to start all over again. That was a problem, right? And remember that I mentioned that query store is something that in SQL Server 2016, 17, and 19 is not enabled by default. You have to enable it manually at user database level if you want to use it. Since several years ago, in Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance, when you create the database, query store is enabled by default. Now, in SQL Server 2022, for the very first time, when you create a new database, query store is enabled by default, because it's being used by a bunch of features that at the end of the day will help us to solve new performance situation problems, right? And also store the information in query store, so eventually if we need to reboot our SQL Server instance, or the server crash, or anything that get restarted, right? All that information is stored within query store, and it doesn't need to start collecting all this information from scratch. This is great because, again, it's taking out a lot of responsibilities from the DBAs. Right? We will see that SQL Server will be learning on certain, you know, scenarios that we will cover it in a second, right? And, you know, when query store and intelligent query processing take certain actions or decisions, they will be there forever unless we clear it manually. Right? There are two new features in intelligent query processing named degree of parallelism feedback and cardinality estimation feedback, DOP feedback and CE feedback. Those two features, right, relies on query store. Then there is a third new feature, super cool, which is parameter sensitive plan optimization, which is not requiring query store, and we will cover it in a second. So, intelligent query processing 2022 is called next generation, right? What do we need to do to use it? Well, first of all, upgrade to SQL Server 2022. Then use compatibility level 160, which is the one that is tied to SQL Server 2022, right? Query store, as we said, enabled by default, and we will be able to use all the features already in the previous version of intelligent query processing, right? It's super important, this part of the key principle. Do not harm, right? And also have the possibility of disabling everything in case we need it, right? Going back a little bit, right? I mentioned briefly these two options, DOP feedback and cardinality estimation feedback, right? Same as the memory grant feedback, the concept here is executing a specific process, right? And then the engine will provide a feedback to adjust the execution for the upcoming execution, right? We all know that setting up the max degree of parallelism on a SQL Server instance is quite hard, right? Depending on who you read or when you read the log, there's tons of opinions, etc. So what we really know that is hard. So what this feature does is that you're going to run your procedures, your query in your SQL Server, right, without you doing anything. What SQL Server will do is evaluate if that specific query will run better with lower DOP, right? It will set the DOP, not for the whole instance, not for the whole database, just for that specific statement, right? And, and the upcoming execution will be monitoring if the change was really beneficial, right? And with that, it can keep lowering down the DOP up to 1, right? If eventually parallelism is not good for that specific situation. We will see it in action in a minute. The same for cardinality estimation feedback. We know that when there is something that is running, maybe we identify that if we specify a hint, right, it may run better, right? What we need to do when we identify this is open the code, manually add the hint, the one that we consider that is the best, right? Recompile the procedure, leave it running again, and then keep monitoring if the change was good or not, right? Now we will see that same as DOP feedback, every time that something is being executed, SQL Server will be evaluating if maybe for some reason there is a hint that will help to improve the resource usage on SQL Server and will automatically put that hint for you without you having to modify any code, right? It will be relying on Query Store. We will see it in action right now. So we went through this slide before. And then the other super cool feature is parameter sensitive plan optimization, right? This is another effort to solve this problem of parameter sniffing, right? What the problem is. Until 2019, since the very first SQL Server versions, when we have a store procedure that we executed for the very first time with a specific parameter, right? What SQL Server will do is compile that plan and save it into cache. So in the upcoming execution, it will reuse that plan in cache, right? So it doesn't have to spend time doing the compilation. There are certain cases, I would say more than the one that I would like to, in where when you use another parameter, so the same store procedure, but with another parameter, the plan that you may have in cache could not be the optimal one, right? In that case, your execution time or your resource usage can be a little bit higher than expected. So in this example, we have the procedure myproc with the parameter number 1, and what the engine will decide that what it needs is to do a check on the table. All right, very good. So then we have the same store procedure, but we call it with a different parameter. In this case, 10. Right. So for this plan, it is better to do a scan, right? A table scan, because of the amount of row that we may have on the tables could be better than than using the SIG. So if we have in our cache, right, the scan, the plan with the scan, then when we run it with the procedure number 1, right, that is better to use a SIG instead of a scan, it will take forever. With PSP optimization, that has changed a little bit. We can run the store procedure with the parameter number 1 that will require an index 6. Then we can execute the store procedure with a different parameter that will require another, a different plan, in this case with the scan. What SQL Server 2022 will be doing is storing both plans in cache. So depending on the parameter that you use, it will choose one plan or the other, right? Of course, it's not going to create one plan for every single parameter, right? It internally will see which is the best plan that fits for the input parameter based on the statistics or the decision that it may take, right? Super, super cool. As I mentioned also before, the pain of setting up max DOP, right? Number of CPUs, number of core thread, etc. Right? With DOP feedback, right? SQL Server will continuously evaluate if eventually that process could run better with a lower DOP, and it will set it for you without doing any code change. Let's see intelligent query processing in action. I have here my management studio. Let's start with DOP feedback. So here what I do is I will be using the wall importer databases, and what I have is I will create a store procedure, right? Get stock item supplier with a parameter that will be doing a certain select. So I will create this procedure. Then in this case, for the demo purpose, what I'm doing is setting up the max DOP to 0, which is the default, right? So what this will be doing, it will be trying to reduce the DOP as we speak. Then SQL 2022 is providing us new events in extended events that will help us to identify, right, the DOP activities. We will see it in a second. So then we have to start the extended event session, and what we are doing here is enabling query store. I mean, again, it's not necessary, but I'm just highlighting it here, setting up some changes for query store, clearing the query store, right? And in this version, we have to manually enable DOP feedback and clearing the procedure cache. The next step, right? I'm not running it here because it takes some time. I will show you the outcome. Then what we do is we execute this procedure that we create up here, right, with certain parameter multiple times in parallel, so hitting the instance like crazy, and what we see as an output is this, right? What is this? This is what we see from the extended event session, right? What it's telling you here, let me open my Summit. So what we see here with this option is, okay, let me make it a little bit bigger. The event name is DOP feedback eligible query. It means that it detects that this specific query that, again, as I said, it was running in multiple times with the same parameter hitting the instance. It say that, hey, I believe that if you run this store procedure, the code within your store procedure using DOP 8, right, it will do quite better, right? Very good. So after a while, I say, hey, listen, now we have a new feedback here is, okay, the DOP before it was running in 8, but if you run it with 6, it could be better. And why is telling you that? It's telling you that the average CPU utilization was 60,000, and with the adjusted, right? The adjusted DOP is going to be less than half. It continue and say, it continue evaluating it, and it can go down and down up to the one that you finish. And it's the last message is that with 6, and now the adjusted elapsed time in millisecond is 25,000, right? And for this, you didn't have to do anything. You didn't have to first, this is not the only procedure that you have on your SQL Server. You have many more running at the same time. But SQL Server is checking for all of them, and if it detects that one of them will run better within a specific DOP, you don't do anything. SQL Server Intelligent Query Processing is doing it for you. Super cool, all right? Then the other one, the CE feedback, cardinality estimation feedback. In this case, what I do here is I will create another extended event session with events for CE feedback, right? Then I have my database Adventure Work 2016, in where I change the compatibility level to 160. I will clean this query store just to start empty. I will clean the procedure cache, and my next step will be creating this store procedure called SP demo CE, which is just doing a select, right? Then I go to my extended event session. I will go to CE feedback. Yeah, CE feedback, and I will watch live data. Right? So we'll see what we get here. So after we create the store procedure, right, we haven't executed yet. What I will do at this point is I will execute this procedure 15 times, right? So I run it 15 times. It just finished. We check the extended event session, nothing. Then we check these two DMBs to see if there is anything that are empty. And now I will execute the store procedure once again, the number 16, right? What happened here? If I go to the extended event session, I see something quite interesting. Hey, your query, if you use this hint, right, it may run better. Okay, it has to be validated, right, because it's query feedback analysis. So we go here, we also check our DMBs, right, and it is saying, hey, there is one here that we identified where the description is validation pending. Okay, I will execute the store procedure one more time, right? I'm checking my DMBs again. What I see is that the verification was passed, and now my query is using this hint, right? And when I go with this to my extended event session, I see that query feedback validation, and the message is that, you know, the original CPU time, 36,000 plus minus, and the one with the feedback, with the hint enabled is 26,000. Right? Again, we didn't have to identify this ourselves. We didn't have to open the procedure and add this hint manually, right? And we didn't have to validate it. It's doing it in background for us. This is huge, right? Super, super useful. And then we have the memory grant feedback, right? What I'm doing here is just, changing the compatibility level. I have a store procedure here, right? SP demo, memory grant feedback. And then what I'm doing, this is super interesting, so pay attention. I'm running this procedure the very first time, right? I also have, no, it should be there. The query plan should be there. So it's going to take few seconds, right? Remember, it's a store procedure that is just created. The plan cache is empty. It's executing it for the very first time. Let's see what happened. We see that it's taking some time, right? So we may try to identify the why it's taking that long, right? But we'll see. This will take around 50 seconds, right? Around 52 seconds, but it's taking too much, right? So when it just finished, we go to the execution plan and we see this warning sign, right, here. And when we expand it, say, hey, you have a warning here, it's spilling on 10 dB. That is why it's taking so long, right? Again, 52 seconds. When we go check my DMB, we see that, we may have something identified in Query Store that is related to your memory consumption. Okay. I will run the procedure one more time. The same procedure, you see, I haven't done anything, right? 52 seconds, the first time we run it. I'm running it again, right? And it took 3 seconds, right? Without me doing anything. When I go to the execution plan, we don't see that warning anymore, right? When we go check my DMB, we say, hey, we have valid feedback for this specific query text, right? And here we have the JSON with all the memory information. So again, originally 52 seconds. The second time I ran it, it took 3 seconds. I didn't do anything, right? So this is super, super cool, right? Okay, let's go back to the presentation. We talk about performance features. Now we go to security, right? We mentioned Ledger for SQL, always encrypted, new features in that area. Scalability, buffer pool scan, ham-free 10 dB, right? Same as DOP, setting up the 10 dB is quite complex. The approach is that what Microsoft is doing is trying to make it ham-free, right? And they have done a great approach with that. And in terms of availability, as we mentioned before, the link feature with Managed Instance, but also the container availability groups, which allow you to synchronize logins and other system options. So the list of innovation at engine level is quite large. I will mention here, for example, XML compression, which is really good, right? So you can save a lot of space, but the counterpart is that you may have to use more CPU usage to handle the compression, right? The Ledger feature for SQL Server. The challenge is, in this case, that we would like to use the power of blockchains on SQL Server for multiple things. For example, if we really need to make sure that our system is consistent in terms of the data that we have in our user database, right? we have to provide certain cryptography validity to make sure that nobody tampered with this data. We know that we can grant permission to the user and maybe select or read-only permission, and nobody is going to be able to delete and set or delete. But what about the sysadmin? What about the administrator? Right? Let's say that we have a banking system, and someone go there and try to change the values of a specific invoice, for example, or anything. You know that as a sysadmin, you can do anything on your SQL table, right? Well, with Ledger, you can create Ledger tables, right? And, first of all, nobody is going to be able to tamper with the data, and you will be able to prove in a cryptography way that the table is not modified, so nobody touch it. So if you have an external entity as a regulator, right, you can provide it and say, hey, what we have here is definitely correct, and you can validate it by yourself. Super cool. As I mentioned briefly before, hand-free 10DB. Before SQL Server 2019, we always have to deal with contention on 10DB. So for that reason, we used to add multiple, and I used to, but we're still adding multiple files on the 10DB. Back then, we also have to specify the trace flags 1117 and 1118 to do certain things on those 10DB files to make them grow, with the same size, with the same step, etc., etc. Then in SQL Server 2016, those trace flags were included, so we didn't have to do it anymore. In SQL Server 2019, Microsoft added, the hackathon feature for 10DB, but for metadata, right? So the PFS concurrency was still there. The 10DB metadata option on, that we have to enable it if we want it, but we still have the problem of the contention with SGAM or GAM. Now, with SQL Server 2022, right, all the latches are gone, right? Super, super cool. So eventually, you can even leave your 10DB as it is with one file. It's still not recommended, but you won't see the latches that you used to see, right? Contain availability group. As I said, this is a new type of availability group that will allow you to synchronize also master and MSDB objects. So there's going to be a version of master and MSDB for each contain availability group. So if you connect with a specific listener, right, for that specific contain availability group, you will see in all the members, one master and one MSDB, right? Super, super interesting. Data virtualization, as I mentioned, I need to access to a modern storage, right, through SQL Server as if there are regular SQL tables, right? So, we can create, access to tables in a storage account, in a container, in a data lake, and also an S3 compatible storage. So that means that you can go to, for example, a storage that is hosting Amazon with data lake over there with no problem, right? So you can access Parquet, Delta, CSV, any text file from there, right? So the storage has to be compatible, right? And also, eventually, you can do backup restore of your user databases to an S3 compatible storage. Super, super cool. All right. I will show you briefly how we do that. Let me see, I believe I had the demo here. Data virtualization. Well, I will owe you that demo. I don't have it in this VM. And we are running out of time, so I will move on and I will show you the last demo for the enhancement in Transact SQL. I want to get new features without learning a new language, right? That is why there are enhancement on handling JSON, a new T-SQL functionality, right? Greatest list, enhancement in string split, right? So I will show you here this one, greatest and least. We can have, multiple values here, and it will return this one will return the greatest between these two values, the greatest between these two values, and the least between these two values, and the same here, right? We can have multiple values, and it will always select the greatest and the least, right? We can also have columns here, right? So it will provide you always this value. Before, this was possible, right? But not with a single function, a native function. We had to do, a bunch of crazy things to get it, right? Same for split string. Now we can say, hey, you can do the string split, but I want the ordinal position number 2. So it will give you, or it will return you only the second one position, right? Because we specify here ordinal number 2. If eventually I put number 4, it will return the last one, right? Oops, here. And if we don't specify anything, it's gonna be same as before. It will return all of them. Super, super cool. The date buckets also, you can, based on a date, you can provide the first day of the month, the last day of the year for that specific value. So something that, again, it was possible before, but, a little bit more complex. Then the generate series option, right? So we can generate a series of number here, right? From 1 to 5, right? Just put in the first value, and the last value is just going to generate the series for you. Here, with 3 value, we should specify the first one, the last one, and the step, right? How we would like to make it grow. And in this case, we can specify the other way around, from 100 to 1 in -5 steps, right? So super cool. Again, possible before, but now with one line, we can do it. Then we have this option in the predicate in where we can use the is distinct from or is not distinct from. For example, we're going to create here a table. Right? When we go to the table, it's a simple table. Right? We see that we have an ID and message. Right? We have IDs with nulls, we have IDs with duplicates and single. So what I will request here is select everything where ID is distinct from 17, right? So it's returning everything that is distinct from 17. And the other way around is where ID is not distinct from 17, right? Super, super interesting things to do the same, but more efficiently. All right. What else? Okay. As a summary, SQL Server 2022, Azure enabled, Azure connected for disaster recovery, analytics, and security. Building query intelligence reduce the time and you gain a lot of performance with the main topic. No code change. You saw it in action today. SQL Server 2022, a lot of innovation, a lot of investment in multiple areas like security, scalability, and availability. Data virtualization and object storage through standard T-SQL, right? And extending the T-SQL language for developers. If you would like to learn more, there are a bunch of links in where you can, first of all, go today and download the developer edition and install it in your computer, right? there are books, there is the learning portal, etc., etc. So in terms of learning opportunities, is plenty of. All right. We at MSC, we were able also to participate in the release. So there are a lot of quotes on the features that are mainly targeted to performance, right? If you want to see this cool video, you have the QR code over there. If you want to learn more, right, this link will tell you to the learning page in Microsoft that will cover all the things that we covered today during the presentation, plus all, because this is the official documentation. The same for Azure SQL, right? So Azure SQL Fundamental will also cover and include Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance. And with that, we finish the presentation. We have, a few minutes for questions. If you would like to reach me offline later for question, or if you just want to, do networking with me, here are my contact, Twitter, LinkedIn, my blog, my email address. Feel free to reach me for anything related to this presentation or anything you would like to. And with that, we just finished the presentation.
Thank you very much, Javier, for this very interesting presentation.
So the audio is not going well.
Am I audible?
Yeah, now you do. Now it's better. Yeah. Okay,
perfect. Thank you so much for your very interesting presentation on SQL Server 2022. And this is really amazing. I'm looking into the chat window to find out if there are any questions. But I will start with asking one question from my side. Mm-hmm. You have talked about the Azure Synapse link in the SQL Server 2022. Mm-hmm. So with this Azure Synapse links available, does this mean that if we have to connect with SQL Server 2022 from Azure Synapse Analytics, we do not need to create any ETL job?
That's correct. You don't have to, the answer for that is depending on what you are trying to do, right? Maybe you have certain tables that are going to make sense to continue doing your ETL, but there are certain other tables that you may like to have them real time in a dedicated SQL pool, right? Because you're going to need it for your data analysis, for your warehouse or whatever. In those cases, those tables is I didn't show it in the demo, but there is an easy way to establish the relationship between your table in SQL Server and the same table in a dedicated SQL pool. Of course, there are certain restrictions. Some data types are not available, etc., but the setup process is quite easy. And, I also tried with a bunch of big tables with a lot of, workload, insert that they delete, and you see that happening you see the changes right away in few seconds in the table in your dedicated SQL pool. All right? So you can combine maybe ETL with this, or eventually if it's not that big, or your need is just to have all your operational tables up in the dedicated SQL pool, you can do it with absolutely no problem. The feature is quite robust.
Okay, so this feature of data virtualization, is it still using Polybase or how it is?
Well, it's what it's called. They call it Polybase V2. It's not what it used to be like Polybase, right? It's using the same fundamentals. Actually, if you want to use data virtualization, you have to install it from the setup, right? So you have to enable those features, and you will see additional Polybase services in your computer, right? But again, it's not only what you were able to do with the original Polybase. Now you have the possibility to connect to a data lake quite easily, right?
Okay. I can see there is a question, either it is a question or a comment from Gaurav. He's saying that data flows must use code for connectivity. In Azure
Uh,
Synapse is integrated.
yeah, the Azure Synapse link is a feature that is out of the box. The only thing that you need is, of course, a Synapse Analytic, a subscription with Azure, etc. Right? So you go to your Azure Synapse Analytic, your Azure Synapse Studio, right? And of course, for everything that you do between SQL and Azure Data Factory, Synapse, or whatever, you need to install the integration runtime on the SQL Server or on another machine just to create the link, right? Then you will see that service available in Synapse, and the only thing you have to do is just select the tables that you would like to replicate.
Okay. I don't see any other questions in the chat window, and I also don't have any other questions. So with this, I would say that thank you very much, Javier, for such a wonderful presentation on SQL Server. And thank
My
you very
pleasure.
much for providing us with your precious time. It is really honor to have you on our forum. And we hope that you will also provide us your precious time in future.
Absolutely, absolutely. Come with that. Mm.
Thank you so much. Have a
All
very
right.
nice evening wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Too. Bye-bye.